He showed up early, not for the crowd, but for the silence before it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Bill adjusted the brim of his old navy blue cap, the one with faded gold lettering that read Korea, 1953. His hands were cold but steady. He had arrived before the sun crept fully over the buildings, before the barricades had even gone up, before anyone had claimed a place on the curb. This was his spot, always had been. Third lamppost from the corner, in line with the bakery window, just enough shade for comfort, just enough space for stillness. He stood, not because there weren't benches, but because standing mattered. Even now, at 82, with knees that ached in the cold and lungs that wheezed if he moved too fast, Bill stood. Across the empty street, shopkeepers opened doors and swept sidewalks. A man jogging with his dog gave a brief nod as he passed, not slowing. Bill didn't expect much more. Most people didn't notice old men in uniform anymore. The parade wouldn't start for over an hour, but that was fine with him. He liked the quiet before the drums, liked hearing the flags flap in the morning wind, liked pretending that when the soldiers would pass by later, they might see him, not just as another wrinkled face, but as one of them. Still. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded program from a past parade. He couldn't remember which year. Maybe 2015. Maybe earlier. The ink had started to blur where his thumb always held it. That didn't matter. It was more of a ritual now than a reference. His breath came out in soft clouds, and his eyes followed the line of the street like he used to follow the horizon at sea. He hadn't missed a single Veterans Day parade since 1960. Not even when his wife passed. Not even when his legs got bad. Not even when his son stopped calling. People came and went. Crowds thickened year after year. But Bill stayed the same. Same coat, same cap, same place. And yet the street felt a little emptier this time. Fewer familiar faces, fewer nods from passing veterans, and none of his old friends from the VFW. Most of them were buried now, men with stories like his, medals like his, memories stitched into their skin like old patches. He pressed his hands together and blew warm air into them, scanning the sidewalk for early arrivals. Still, no one. That was okay. He wasn't here for the company. He was here to remember. What they gave, what they lost, what they carried home, and what they didn't. His back ached, but he didn't sit. Not yet. And when the first distant beat of a bass drum echoed down the street, Bill straightened his spine, pressed his feet flat to the ground, and lifted his chin. The parade was coming, and though he stood alone, he stood with everyone who couldn't anymore. The sound of drums came first, slow, steady, deliberate. Bill knew that rhythm, not just from parades, but from life. The kind of beat that kept you moving when everything else wanted to make you stop. He straightened his back as the first unit rounded the corner. The parade had begun. Children clutched small American flags along the sidewalks, their cheeks flushed with excitement. Parents pointed at the color guard, snapping photos. Confetti drifted down from a nearby rooftop like snow that didn't melt. People waved, people clapped, but most didn't notice Bill. He didn't blame them. To them, he was just an old man in a too big coat, standing too still, holding a folded program like it still meant something. The ROTC group passed first, high schoolers in stiff uniforms, trying their best to stay in sync. A few looked nervous. One boy dropped his rifle and scrambled to pick it up. Bill smiled gently. He remembered that feeling, trying to look older than you were, to carry weight you hadn't earned yet. Behind them came the marching band, bright jackets, loud brass, coordinated chaos. Bill flinched slightly at the first crash of cymbals, but quickly relaxed. The music wasn't for him, but he welcomed it all the same. And then the unit came into view. Not his unit, not anymore. Those men were long gone, but this was the moment he came for, always. He stood a little taller. Most were Gulf War and Afghanistan vets now. Younger, stronger, with patches he didn't recognize. Some wore sunglasses. Others carried signs with names of the fallen. A few nodded toward the crowd. Bill raised his hand in a slow, practiced salute. No one saw it. Or, if they did, they didn't return it. He held the gesture anyway, because that's what you do when respect isn't about being seen. It's about being given, whether it's received or not. The line of vets passed, followed by more community groups, school buses filled with waving kids, and old fire engines honking their horns. The applause grew louder, but Bill felt smaller. He shifted his weight slightly, the ache in his knee blooming into something sharper. Still, he didn't sit. He wouldn't, not while the flags were moving. A little girl with braids ran toward the curb and waved her flag wildly in his direction. For a moment, he thought maybe she was waving at him. But her father pulled her back quickly, whispering something about safety, and she turned her gaze to the float behind him. He lowered his eyes just for a second, and then he saw her. Midway down the next unit, a line of active duty service members marching in perfect formation, was a young woman. Brown hair tied neatly back, face calm, steps exact. She didn't stand out at first, but something about her posture, the way she carried herself, made him notice. And then, just before she passed, she turned her head, just slightly. Her eyes met his, and for the first time all morning, Bill felt seen. She didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't speak, but her eyes locked with his in a way that said everything. It lasted no more than 2 seconds, but Bill's heart hadn't felt that steady in years. The parade moved on, but Bill's thoughts stayed behind, right where her eyes had met his. It had only been a moment, barely that, but in the quiet echo of footsteps and fading applause, it lingered, like a note held just a little longer than expected. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding and adjusted the collar of his coat. The November wind had picked up again. Around him, families chatted about candy thrown from floats. Parents hoisted kids onto shoulders. Teenagers leaned against barricades, distracted by their phones. And in all that movement, Bill stood still, just another outline among the flags. He was used to it. The older he got, the more invisible he seemed to become. At the grocery store, the cashier rarely made eye contact. At the pharmacy, he was Sir, but never Bill. In his own neighborhood, kids sped by on bikes without even a nod. Not out of disrespect, he didn't believe that, but because they didn't know what to look for. They didn't know what stories were hidden behind old faces, and he didn't blame them. Not really, but it still hurt. He lived alone now. The house was quiet, too quiet sometimes. His wife, Marjorie, had passed 5 years earlier, and with her went the warmth in the wallpaper, the rhythm in the rooms. His son, Tom, lived 3 states away and called on holidays. They were cordial, careful, like 2 people who once spoke the same language but hadn't practiced in years. Bill spent most days in his recliner, watching the news on low volume, or walking to the post office even when there was no mail to send. He read the same paperbacks over and over again. Sometimes he wrote notes in the margins, just so they'd feel different. In the hallway closet, tucked beneath a wool blanket, was a box of old service medals, bronze stars, campaign ribbons, a photo of him and his crew standing next to a battered Jeep, all grins and dust. Nobody asked about them anymore. Not even the mailman, but every year, no matter what, he came to the parade. Not for the music, not for the spectacle, but because it was the one place where remembrance was still public, still sacred. He remembered the first time he marched in one, fresh from the service, uniform pressed, chest out. People had clapped back then. Kids had pointed. Strangers had said thank you. Now they clapped for the noise, for the floats, for the candy tossed from a fire truck. And that was okay, he told himself. Times changed. But standing here, feeling more like a shadow than a soldier, it was hard not to wonder. Had he been forgotten? Just then, a gust of wind lifted the edge of the program still clutched in his hand. He looked down at it, the print smudged from time and weather. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat. And when he looked back toward the marching unit, the young woman was still visible, just barely. She hadn't looked away. She'd slowed. And something about that made Bill's heart ache in a different way. Not because he was invisible, but because for a fleeting moment, someone had seen him. The moment passed, but the feeling didn't. Bill blinked as the young woman disappeared into the crowd of uniforms ahead. The rhythm of the parade picked up again. Boots striking pavement, snare drums tapping out precision, brass instruments rising and falling in practiced waves. But something in him had shifted. He no longer felt like part of the background. The street ahead was full now. More floats, more school groups. Marching cheerleaders with white gloves and wide smiles. An antique fire truck rolled by, children waving from the back. A local scout troop held up a homemade banner that wobbled in the wind. People clapped and cheered. Phones snapped pictures. Bill stayed in place, his eyes not on the noise, but on the spot where the woman had walked. He couldn't quite explain it, even to himself. He didn't know her, had never seen her before. But the look she gave him, the way she slowed, the quiet gravity of her attention, it wasn't just polite recognition. It felt like memory, like someone had reached across time and said, "I know you." It had been years since anyone looked at him like that. He shifted his weight again, the familiar ache in his right knee rising as the cold crept in deeper. He winced but remained standing, still and firm, as if sitting now would undo the strength that had held him upright all morning. The parade continued. Marching bands, local businesses, decorated pickup trucks tossing candy into the crowd. A boy nearby picked up a miniature flag and tapped his mother on the arm. "Why is that man just standing there?" he asked, pointing toward Bill. His mother glanced over and offered a smile that was kind but uncertain. "He's a veteran, sweetie. He's showing respect." Bill heard it, but he didn't turn. He didn't need to. The boy's voice faded, and Bill returned to the moment. He had long ago accepted that people often noticed without knowing how to engage. That wasn't disrespect, it was distance. A kind the world had grown used to. He had too. But now, the memory of those eyes, hers, wouldn't leave him. They had paused on him like a prayer. Quiet, unspoken, whole. He thought of Marjorie then. The way she used to look at him after long days. That same steady kind of presence. Not searching for words, just being there, fully. He wondered if the young woman knew what she'd given him. If she had any idea that one glance had become a tether, tying him back to something he hadn't felt in years, meaning. The parade began to thin as it neared its end. The fire truck sirens wailed one last time. Police cars rolled slowly by. A cleanup crew followed with brooms and trash bags. Bill let out a long breath. He'd come to remember the past, but instead, he'd been reminded he still had a place in the present. The wind had shifted again, and with it, the energy of the street. People were beginning to pack up. Candy wrappers danced along the curb. Folding chairs creaked as families stood and stretched. Some lingered, taking selfies with the last of the floats. Others began making their way back to minivans and quiet neighborhoods. But Bill stayed still. He wasn't watching the parade anymore. He was watching the formation at the far end of the block, the group of active-duty soldiers moving in tight rows, feet landing in unison, shoulders squared against the wind. And there she was again, closer now, the same young woman, hair tucked neatly beneath her cover, back straight, gaze forward. Her face was composed, calm, her movements exact, but Bill could feel it before it happened. Just as she passed the third lamppost, the one that marked his spot, she turned her head slightly, only slightly, enough to break the clean line of her formation, enough to find him again. Their eyes locked, and everything else, the cheers, the music, the chatter, faded. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't salute. She just looked at him, not past him, not through him, at him. It was a look full of weight, of understanding, of deliberate connection. The kind of look that only exists between people who know what it means to serve, to lose, to remember. For that 1 second, Bill was no longer a bystander. He was seen, he was honored, and he was not alone. She held the gaze for a heartbeat longer than she should have. Then, with practiced discipline, she turned her head back, eyes forward, steps unchanged. The rest of her unit never missed a beat. But Bill had. His heart thudded once in his chest, like an old engine catching flame. He reached up slowly and adjusted his cap with trembling fingers, not to reposition it, but to give himself something to do, something to hold on to while he processed what had just happened. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from or where she was stationed, but in a sea of movement, she had chosen stillness. In a day full of noise, she had offered quiet respect. And Bill felt it, not just as a man who had once worn the uniform, but as a man who'd felt forgotten by the world that kept marching. Now, someone had broken the rhythm, just for him. And though the moment had passed, it left behind something lasting, like footprints in fresh snow, proof that someone had been there, that someone had noticed, and that someone still cared. The cadence of boots on pavement echoed down the block, sharp and unwavering. Precision, timing, order. But then, something broke. Not with noise, but with intention. The young woman took one final step in formation, then paused. Her right foot hesitated, just a fraction, enough to fall out of sync, enough to draw a whisper of confusion from someone in the crowd. And then, without warning, she stepped out of formation, out of rhythm, out of the silent wall of uniformity that had carried her down the street. Gasps rose like wind through leaves. Bill's breath caught in his throat. She moved with certainty, calm, measured steps that cut across the parade's path and over to the curb, toward him. Time seemed to slow. The crowd hushed, first out of confusion, then out of instinct. Parents lowered their phones, children stilled. Even the nearby drummer softened his beat. She stopped 2 steps in front of Bill, her hands at her sides, her gaze steady. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice strong but reverent, "thank you for your service." Bill tried to speak, but the words got tangled in his chest. He hadn't been addressed like that in years, not by someone in uniform, not like this. He opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes filled faster than he expected. She didn't move, didn't shift. She stood not in ceremony, but in solidarity. And in that silence, surrounded by hundreds of onlookers, something rare bloomed between them. Stillness with meaning. Bill lifted his trembling hand, slow, intentional. He brought it to his brow and held the salute, not out of duty, but out of deep, wordless gratitude. For the memory she honored, for the voice she gave him without asking anything in return. She returned the salute, clean, perfect, then lowered her hand with care, never breaking eye contact. A man nearby whispered, "She just left formation." His voice wasn't mocking. It was awed. A small round of applause began somewhere to the left, then a few more claps, then more. Not thunderous, not performative, just honest, grateful. Bill didn't notice the clapping, not really. His focus was on her, on the eyes that had found his again, that refused to rush, that stood still in the middle of motion, just for him. She nodded once. He nodded back. And then, just as quietly as she had stepped away, she turned and walked back toward her unit, slipping in without a break, her steps once again in perfect rhythm. The formation continued down the street, and the sounds of the parade slowly returned. But everything felt different now. The beat of the drums wasn't just for show. The waving flags meant something again. And Bill, standing there, hands folded now at his waist, felt lighter. Not because anything had been taken away, but because something had been added, something seen, something remembered. He had come to honor the past, but now the present had honored him back. Bill remained standing long after the woman had returned to her unit. He could still feel the weight of her eyes, the silence they'd shared, the unspoken understanding that passed between them. It echoed louder than any drum roll. His arm, still lowered from the salute, felt heavy now, but not from fatigue, from meaning. He hadn't saluted like that in years, not since the funeral, not since he stood in the rain beside Marjorie's flag-draped casket and whispered his goodbye. But this time, the salute wasn't for loss. It was for recognition. And recognition, he realized, was its own kind of healing. Applause rippled across the sidewalk again, not for the floats, not for the marching bands, but for the moment, for them. Bill blinked against the light, his vision slightly blurred from emotion and age. A small group of people nearby now looked in his direction, not with curiosity, but with quiet respect. One man, mid-40s, flannel shirt holding his son's hand, nodded toward him and said, "Thank you, sir." A teenager beside him followed with, "My grandpa served. I think he would have liked this." Bill gave a soft nod. His voice still hadn't come back. Then a little boy stepped forward, no more than 7. He held a miniature flag in his gloved hand and looked up at Bill with wide, serious eyes. "Were you really in the war?" he asked. Bill leaned down just enough to meet the boy's gaze. "Yes, a long time ago." "Were you scared?" He paused. "Sometimes, but I had people beside me. That made it easier." The boy nodded slowly, then offered the flag. "You can have this. I've got another." Bill smiled, truly smiled, for the first time that day. "Thank you," he said, voice gravelly but full. "That means a lot." The boy returned to his father, who gave Bill a knowing look, the kind that men sometimes share when no words are needed. One by one, more people came forward. Some offered a handshake, others just stood nearby for a moment, quietly honoring what had just happened. Bill didn't need a microphone or a spotlight. He didn't need to give a speech. He had already said everything that mattered with a single salute, and someone had answered. Across the street, the parade continued. Though the energy felt different now, the noise softer, the pace slower, as if the entire street had taken a collective breath and remembered what this day was supposed to be about. Not spectacle, but sacrifice. Not entertainment, but honor. Bill sat down slowly on the bench near the lamppost, letting the cold wood press against his coat. He held the child's small flag in his hand, the fabric fluttering lightly in the wind. He watched the final units pass by with new eyes. He was no longer just watching history roll by. He was part of it again. The final float passed with a wave from the mayor, and a cheer rose from the crowd as the parade officially ended. Loudspeakers crackled out a thank you message, and people began to disperse, folding chairs, brushing off coats, wrangling excited children. But Bill didn't move, not right away. He sat on the cold wooden bench beside the curb, a child's flag still gripped gently in his hand. The small piece of fabric fluttered in the breeze like a ribbon of memory, soft but rooted in something solid. For the first time in years, he wasn't eager to slip away before the noise died down. He was content to stay. Several people walked by and offered a nod, a quiet thank you, or a brief smile. And this time, Bill met each one with a nod of his own, not because he had to, but because the weight in his chest had shifted. It didn't press anymore. Carried. A young couple approached, maybe in their 30s. The woman held a baby wrapped tightly in a quilt, and the man had a toddler riding on his shoulders. "We saw what happened," the man said. "It was moving. Thank you." Bill hesitated, then said quietly, "She did all the hard work." The woman smiled. "Still, I'm glad my kids got to see that." Bill looked at the baby's round cheeks, the toddler's curious eyes. He thought of his son when he was that small, back when the world still felt wide open and uncomplicated. "I hope they remember it," Bill said. "I think they will," the man replied. Then they moved on, leaving behind the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. Later, a teenage boy lingered nearby with his hands stuffed in his hoodie. He shuffled his feet, then finally said, "My granddad served in Vietnam. He never talked about it, but I think he would have liked you." Bill chuckled softly. "Then I would have liked him too." More people came, not in crowds but in moments, one at a time, quiet ripples in a morning that had begun in stillness and grown into something he hadn't expected. Connection. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was real. He'd been afraid, deep down, that the world had moved on without remembering. That time had dulled the edges of sacrifice, that names were fading from plaques, that medals gathered more dust than meaning. But this morning proved something else. It proved that remembrance still lived, not just in ceremonies, but in choices, in glances, in the courage of a young woman stepping out of line when it mattered most, and in the hearts of strangers who saw an old man and chose to stand beside him, even for a moment. As the crowd thinned and the street began to clear, Bill stood one last time. His knees protested, but he pushed through it, because that's what you do when you've been carried by something greater than pain. He looked down the street where the soldiers had marched and felt a peace he hadn't known he was missing. Not alone, after all. The next year, Bill came early again. Third lamppost from the corner, same long coat, same well-worn cap. But this time, something felt different. Not in his bones, though they ached less somehow, but in his posture. He stood with ease, with presence. He wasn't just waiting for a parade, he was holding space. He looked up and down the street. The barricades were already set. Families were trickling in sooner than usual. Someone had brought coffee for the crowd. A little girl skipped by in red boots and waved to him without hesitation. Bill waved back. A man he didn't recognize approached with a folding chair slung over one shoulder. "You mind if I join you?" he asked. "Not at all," Bill replied, motioning toward the spot beside him. Soon there were 5 people standing where once there had only been one. By the time the band began to warm up in the distance, Bill's corner wasn't quiet anymore. It was full of voices, of respect, of community. And when the units began to march, Bill stood taller. He didn't just salute this time. He was saluted in return. One by one, some of the younger soldiers broke rank just slightly to nod his way, or offer a crisp salute of their own. And then, just like last year, she came. Same sharp steps, same calm expression. Only this time she wasn't just a face in the crowd. She saw him immediately. And this time, she smiled. She stepped out once again, not hesitantly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her place and chose to stand beside someone else's for a moment. She stopped at the curb, saluted first. Bill returned it, steady and certain. And then, in a gesture he hadn't expected, she handed him a folded piece of paper. No words, just a soft nod. Then she turned and rejoined her unit, graceful as ever. Bill looked at the note later, when the street had quieted and the people had gone home. It simply said, "Same time next year. Thank you for reminding me what this really means." Bill folded the note gently, placed it in his coat pocket, and looked up at the emptying street. He had never intended to start something. But sometimes, the smallest moments, moments when you think no one's watching, become something more. A salute, a step out of line, a shared stillness in the noise. And just like that, what was once a private ritual became a new tradition. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.